Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a case that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. A love story that turned incredibly deadly. We're going to look at how a romance that seemed absolutely picture perfect, right there on the sunny coast of Florida, quietly morphed into one of the state's deadliest massacres. It's a story that kicks off with so much optimism and a brand new start, but ends with a reality so devastating it left 6 innocent people dead. Let's get into it. So here's the massive question we have to grapple with right off the bat. How on earth does a quiet, seemingly normal breakup turn into a meticulously planned 200-mile massacre? Because from the outside looking in, this story starts with so much hope. It was a fresh start that completely masks a violent reality bubbling just beneath the surface. To really understand how we get to that horrific conclusion, we need to rewind to where the story actually begins. Picture this. It's the fall of 2025, and a 51-year-old guy named Russell Coate decides he's ready for a massive life change. He completely uproots himself, leaves his life in Illinois in the rearview mirror, and moves all the way down to the warm, sunny coast of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And the catalyst for this huge cross-country jump? A 46-year-old woman named Larissa Bludaya. Clearly, this relationship was serious enough for him to chase this new beginning. Soon after, he moves into a home with Larissa and her 18-year-old son, Ben, right in Fort Lauderdale's really charming Victoria Park neighborhood. Now, this is where you start to see a really stark contrast between perception and reality. To friends, to neighbors, even to the property manager of their townhome, they just seemed like your totally normal, everyday couple. Colt seamlessly blended into Larissa's life. He even became a super trusted figure to her extended family, who actually lived over 200 miles away in a quiet, gated community in Sarasota. He had stayed at their Sarasota home, he'd watched their pets while they traveled. He was a familiar, trusted face. But beneath that calm surface, hidden cracks were forming. And tragically, that very trust he built and his inside knowledge of the family's homes and routines would eventually become his absolute most terrifying advantage. Fast forward to the end of that very same year, 2025, and the dream is officially over. Those cracks we just mentioned, they completely shattered the relationship. Russell and Larissa broke up. So the guy who just moved across the entire country for love now finds himself packing his bags and moving out of that Victoria Park home. Honestly, it just looked like a common everyday occurrence, a relationship simply running its course. Or, well, that's what everyone thought. And this right here, this is arguably the most chilling part of this entire story. Look, whenever a tragedy of this magnitude happens, we all desperately look for red flags, right? We look for a history of threats, erratic behavior, maybe a documented mental health crisis. But Russell Coate's record, it was essentially spotless. Law enforcement confirmed he had absolutely no known history of violence, no documented mental health issues whatsoever. When they later pulled his phone records, there was zero evidence of an obvious trigger. No explosive text arguments, no threats, nothing. The relationship had just ended. This totally common life event was basically masking a quiet, calculated rage that he managed to hide from absolutely everyone. To really drive home just how non-threatening this guy appeared, you have to listen to the words from a frantic 911 call that was made later by Larissa's own daughter. When she was trying to describe Coate to the dispatcher, she didn't call him a monster or a threat or even a stalker. No, she simply referred to him as an admirer, someone who used to be in her life. He was so ordinary in his outward appearance that those closest to the situation literally didn't even recognize the danger standing right in front of them. So let's look at how this quiet heartbreak built up to its horrifying climax. Behind that totally ordinary exterior, Coate's plans for his future were destroyed, and in the darkness of that heartbreak, he started forming a new, horrific plan. That plan went into motion on the morning of Tuesday, February 10, 2026. Coate drove back to the Victoria Park home in Fort Lauderdale, literally the very place his Florida dream had started. There, he confronted his ex-partner, Larissa, and her 18-year-old son, Ben. And in a devastating act of violence, he shot and killed them both. The carnage had officially begun. Now, it's what happens next that is absolutely crucial to understand. With the first part of his plan complete, Coates didn't panic. He didn't run away. He calmly got back into his car and began this cold, methodical 200-mile drive directly across the state of Florida, driving from the Atlantic side all the way over to the Gulf Coast. Traffic cameras in Punta Gorda actually captured his car as it headed north. It's this silent, incredibly damning visual record of a man deliberately making his way toward his next set of victims. Let's break down the exact timeline of how the rest of this day unfolded. We know the morning started with a double homicide in Fort Lauderdale. Fast forward to 11:01 a.m. Coates' car is recorded entering the Amberley gated community in Sarasota. Remember how we talked about his integration into the family earlier? Well, he gained access to this secure neighborhood without a hitch because he was a familiar face. He drove straight to a house on Fallcrest Circle, which was the home of Larissa's mother, 66-year-old Florida Storyar. What happened next inside that house is just a sequence of unimaginable horror. Moments after pulling into the driveway, Cott entered the home and murdered 49-year-old Olga Greinert, who was the family housekeeper and a close friend, as well as 39-year-old Yaroslav Bludoy, Larissa's brother. And then the psychology here gets even darker. At some point after these murders, Cott actually pulled out his phone and sent a suicidal text message to his own family. And then he just waited. In a terrifying display of cold-blooded patience, he sat there for 37 minutes. He sat in a house with two people he had just murdered, waiting for his final victims to walk through the front door. 37 minutes later, Florida Stolyar's husband, 61-year-old Anatoly Ayev, pulled into the driveway. As he walked toward his home, Coates shot and killed him. A neighbor actually heard the boom, rushed outside, and found Anatoly in the yard, which is what prompted that first 911 call at 12:30 p.m. When Florida finally returned home, Coates killed her too, completing his devastating plan before eventually turning one of his guns on himself. When Sarasota deputies finally rushed onto the scene, they walked into absolute chaos. They found the neighbor desperately performing CPR on Anatoly. And when they moved inside the house, fearing there was still an active shooter, they were met with a scene of pure horror. There were more than 20 shell casings scattered across the floor, and Coates lay dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. As detectives started connecting the dots, a search of Coates' vehicle proved without a shadow of a doubt that this was definitely not some spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. They found what can only be described as a staggering mobile arsenal. We're talking 4 handguns, a massive amount of ammunition, 5 knives, rope, tape, and even an axe. Finding all of this shows us just how incredibly premeditated this entire massacre really was. As the investigation really got underway, the physical evidence clearly pointed to Russell Cott. So the question for investigators wasn't who committed these atrocities, but rather why. The motive for the first 2 murders in Fort Lauderdale seemed tragically clear. It was born from a failed relationship. But why on earth did he expand his rampage? Why drive 200 miles just to systematically execute Larissa's mother, her brother, her stepfather, and the family housekeeper? The sheriff's office has been completely transparent about this, putting out a statement saying the suspect's motivation for targeting the Sarasota victims is unknown. It remains this dark black hole at the center of a senseless tragedy, a mystery we honestly may never truly solve. Now, while it's so easy for us to focus all our attention on the psychology of the killer, doing that does a massive disservice to the people whose futures were stolen that day. So let's respectfully center this narrative right where it belongs, on the 6 innocent victims. In Fort Lauderdale, we have 46-year-old Larissa Bludoy and her 18-year-old son, Ben Azivov, who was literally just starting his adult life. In Sarasota, Larissa's mother, 66-year-old Florida Stolyar, her 61-year-old husband, Anatoly Ayev, and 39-year-old Yaroslav Bludoy. And the 6th victim, 49-year-old Olga Greinert, remembered by her loved ones as this kind, warm, and wonderful person who was simply trying to help a family she cared about. These are the faces and the names that should leave a lasting impression on us. There's a quote from Olga Greinert's family that I think perfectly encapsulates the staggering ripple effect of this event. They said, "The lives of a family and 2 different communities have changed forever. 6 innocent people were murdered in a highly calculated campaign of revenge that stretched all the way from one coast of Florida to the other. The grief and the shock left in the wake of this tragedy is simply immeasurable." Officially, this case is closed as an isolated murder-suicide. But that feeling of unease, that doesn't just fade away. This whole explainer leaves us with a final, really provocative question. How do we actually protect ourselves from the hidden dangers lurking behind the ordinary faces we welcome into our lives? Russell Cott's Rampage is a brutal reminder of the fragility of trust. It shows us how quickly a personal grievance can spiral into a deadly obsession, and how sometimes the absolute greatest dangers aren't strangers hiding in the dark, but the people sitting right in our own living rooms. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you next time as we use the facts to uncover the truth.